It is a great honor for the Israel Society of Ecology and Environmental Sciences to guest Professor Daniel Rubinštein, a very well-known zoologist from Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Princeton University. Among other awards that is taking place and duties, he is also director of the program in African Studies. And therefore, he is leading various important, interesting projects in Africa, such as Zebra Sociality, Nutrition Project, Decision-Making and Movement Ecology, and Evolution of Social Norms. Professor Rubinštein's research focuses on decision-making in animals. Much of his recent research is on the adaptive value of behavior and is centered on understanding the social dynamics of horses, zebras, and asses. Professor Rubinštein wrote more than 120 scientific papers which were published in the best ecological journal and edited 4 books. I invite Professor Rubinštein to give his talk on From a Species to Ecosystem Conservation, the case of charismatic gravy zebra. Please.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the organizers for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to be here and to meet so many old friends and colleagues and to meet many new ones. As many of you know, we've been on a tour of Israel looking at various conservation problems. And although I'm going to talk on these lovely creatures, the gravy zebra, the ecosystem they're embedded within and which they work with and impact people have a lot of the same parallels to the landscapes in Israel. So treat them as a metaphor, if you will, as we move forward to look at the problems that are confronting you. I'll talk about the landscape, the ecosystem I know best, which is the African savanna. And you can see in this cartoon that it consists of 3 major types. There's the open grasslands, there's the riverine, and there's the bushed grasslands that have luggers or nacals that penetrate them. And you'll see the distribution of species that many of you have seen, especially those that have gone on safari. Some are limited to particular habitats, such as the dik-dik, which lives in the bush woodland, and the bushbuck, which lives along the riverine areas. Some of the grassland species are also limited to the grassland, but others range across a variety of the habitats. So it's a complex mosaic in which species, some are specialists on particular types of vegetation, some use the habitats for defense against predation, and some move about because they need a mixture of food and landscapes to do the different things that they do to sustain themselves. The key is that certain players, like the elephant and somewhat the giraffe, are keystone engineers. Keystone species are species that have a disproportionate impact on the environment relative to their abundance, and they're also engineers in that they bulldoze and change the landscape. And so when elephants roam freely, not in protected areas, but across the landscape, and choose the habitats that they want to go to at their own free will, they sometimes bulldoze down the trees, tear up the bushland, knock over the few trees in the grassland, and keep the habitat as a mosaic of treeless areas, dense tree areas when they get bored with them. And as a result, they keep this rich array of species surviving on the landscape. So if you have a healthy elephant population and they eat 150 kilograms of food per day, if you have a healthy elephant population, then this mosaic is maintained. Put poachers on the scene and all sorts of havoc can be reaped. If the poachers are successful in winnowing down the population of elephants, then the bushed woodland and the forest habitats and the browsers will increase in density. If there are protected areas that the government and the people set aside, then those refuges or safe havens can be where the elephants go, but when they get there to save their lives, they over-impact the habitat. So while the protected areas protect the elephants, the demise of the ecosystem as we know it can occur, especially if the protected areas are too small, because they knock down the trees, they open the grassland, they increase the true grazers at the expense of the browsers. So the mosaic is the preferred condition, and the preferred solution is to eliminate poaching and not rely on the protected areas. Now, protected areas although they're beneficial, they can cause problems if the elephants are restricted to them. And therefore, protected areas have their own problems. The history of a protected area is that a bunch of scientists and policymakers agree that critical species ranges, as defined by here, need a safe haven. So they gazette an area and they set it aside. They implement it, deploy it, build it, and immediately people respond. And they fragment the landscape and make the protected area an island. And protected areas that are islands tend to lose species. So these are the censuses of David Western around the Amboseli National Park in Kenya. And over time, the solid line shows that the species density and the species diversity is lost because of the edge effects and the area effects that we know from island biogeography. But interestingly, the species on the edge outside the park also decline. And the reason is many species need multiple habitats in order to survive. Dry season, wet season changes. So their decisions as they move rely on the protected areas. If they can't get in, the populations crash. If they can't get in, they can get poached. And so even setting up a protected area doesn't guarantee that the species outside will fare much better than the species inside. And therefore, the parks may not be microcosms that represent a traditional ecosystem. And going forward with climate change, areas that were once good for species may turn out to be not so good, and the fragmentation and the development that occurs around the parks may in fact leave the habitats unavailable for a whole host of species. So the real solution is, can we find ways to protect key species, whether keystone species or engineers, and therefore maintain the ecosystems and the diverse number of species that live there apart from creating protected areas? And I think the answer is perhaps. The jury is still out. But to understand why it's important, we're going to turn to some economics. We're going to look at what's called an environmental Kuznets curve. And what this is displays the environmental harm that people do to their environment as a function of their income. And so as people get richer, they start to get rich by inflicting harm to their environment. And at some point, the curve turns over because people get fed up and want to improve the quality of life, and they start investing in cleaning up the environment. This is particularly true for water and air. People, as they get richer, finally get fed up with water and air that's not pure, and they spend money to clean it up. And so the environmental harm goes down when people are fairly rich. And it generally follows this trend that agricultural peoples that have low density inflict very little harm on the environment. As they industrialize, they tend to use the resources and impact the landscape mightily, and therefore increase the harm that they see. Then, as the society gets rich and they turn over to a service society, they change their values and they want to clean it up, and the harm goes down. But the question is, does economic growth require environmental degradation? We assume that this is the norm, but does it have to be? And we're doing a great experiment using our ecological knowledge with the Kenyan landscape, because the Kenyan landscape is full of people, but at the moment their impact is very limited, and they're tied to the land. 70% of Kenya's people live directly off the land, so their impact is not great yet because they're pre-industrialized, and what industry they have tends to be located in particular areas. Can we cut the top of the mountain off? Ideally, we'd like to move straight across from no impact to no harm as we increase the livelihoods and the wealth of the people. Can this be done? Well, the answer is still out, but there's a possibility because 70% of Kenya's wildlife lives on private land. It doesn't reside in national parks, even though Kenya has set aside 25% of their country into national parks. The landscapes that I'm going to talk about are Laikipia and Samburu, two big governmental districts, the equivalents of counties or states. And you can see by the color, there's a variety of land use patterns. The beige or pink represents small farms that don't have irrigation. They rely on the water towers of Mount Kenya, the Aberdares, and the Rift Valley to provide rainfall-fed farming. And so that's why they're limited to this southern crescent around the Laikipia ecosystem. Everywhere else is dry. Right here, the rainfall is about 400 to 500 millimeters per year, and as you move up here, it drops down to 200 and then 100. And so you move from a semi-arid to an arid landscape. And so therefore, agriculture, growing crops, is limited, and most of the livelihoods depend on some sort of ranching. The yellow shows commercial ranching, where people are managing the herds for profit, for cash, and they're largely developing steers for beef production. The light green represent pastoralists who have been sedentarized. Traditional pastoralism has people moving around following the rainfall gradients, but the governments don't like people moving around. Their loyalty is questioned. And so they've given them title deed to these little pieces of land called group ranches, where anywhere from 10 to 15,000 people and their tens of thousands of animals now have to reside. It changes the use of the landscape. They can't rely on the movements that are natural for wildlife and for pastoralism. And so by sedentarizing them, it's changed their impact on the landscape. So these are the group ranches. The 5 red dots are the 5 areas that I work, and I'm going to talk about today in the talk. Some of the work that I do is on conservancies and commercial ranches, Impala and Alpegida Conservancy. Some are on heavily ecotourism areas where livestock has only been reintroduced, and that's Lewa, and then the group ranches of Koija in Omotiak and Laikipia and Westgate in Samburu. These are the areas where I work, and I'll weave the tale about how the charismatic Grevy's zebra as a focal point has impacts on preserving these landscapes. So the question then becomes, can staying wildlife generate income and help other species by protecting the ecosystem? And I'm going to talk about 3 case studies. And the first one has to do with predation and the impacts on both Grevy's zebra and plain zebra. And the 2 questions we want to ask are, how does predation affect the population dynamics of zebras? Can they sustain themselves? At what levels of predation? And can these populations be sustained where predators roam? And if so, can they then help the ecosystem and help other species? Well, to start, we need to measure the impact of predation, and that's hard. Very few kills are actually detected, so we've had to develop other techniques to determine what impact predators have on zebras in particular. And what we've done is we collect the scat of lions and dry it, and then by using light microscopy and the hairs from shot skins, we actually have determined that we can look at the ratio of the medulla and the cortex to determine the different species of zebras, because the ratios are different, as well as the differences to bovids, where the medulla doesn't have a solid group of pigment all the way through, and that's why they're brown, whereas zebras tend to be black. So we can identify in the scat hair, and we can take those hair samples and ask the question, whose hair did it belong to when it was alive? And we can see that the preliminary data from 50 lions on 30 kills is that 93% of the scat contains zebra hair, 68% of the scat with zebra hair contains Grevy zebra hair, and most importantly, a slight majority of the zebras killed by lions are Grevy zebras. Now, what's critical here is the Lewa Conservancy has a population of about 400 Grevies and about 1,600 plain zebras. If lions were eating at random, we'd expect only 25% of the kills to be Grevy zebra, and it's yet 56%. And so that's why there's a highly significant bias showing that lions prefer to eat Grevy zebra. Not good for an endangered species. So that's part of the problem. We now know the impact. We also need to know other aspects of the vital rate, and that means we need to look at survival and fecundity. And we fortunately have nature's natural barcode so that we don't have to do mark recapture, we can do site recite. And by using fast, newly developed algorithms from computer scientists, we can do recite and site analysis to get sex and age-specific vital rates, survival and birth rate, and we can then put those into models to try to understand what impact different levels of predation have. In other words, we can at least do what-if experiments to change the level of predation to see if we can find a sustainable level of predators that will keep zebra numbers from going extinct. We also look at foal patrol, which is a very intensive effort to go find foals because they often disappear before you see them. So you've got to be driving around to make sure you don't underestimate the birth rate, and so you don't underestimate the predation rate on the youngest recruits that can potentially sustain a population. So armed with that, we can start to look at the pattern of predation of the populations both on Lewa Conservancy and in Kenya nationally. When I started, there were about 14,000 Grevy's zebras in Kenya, and now the number hovers around 2,000, slightly increasing to about 2,500 in the year 2014. Lewa Conservancy has always had the largest population of Grevy's zebra in the world on private land, about 650. But when the first lions were spotted by us coming from Barana, a neighboring conservancy, in 1999, numbers have declined. In fact, we did an experiment to translocate Grevy zebras to another park that I talked about yesterday. And before that, we moved off 250 plain zebras to test the translocation. By removing that many plain zebras, the number of Grevy zebras went up. But after that, Grevy zebras are going down, and now there's fewer than 400. There's only about 300 left. And a large fraction of this, we think, is due to predation. And so can the predation problem be managed? And what we do is we do forecasting using very simple models. So this is an age-structured model of infants, juveniles, and adults in year T. We want to know how many will there be next year in T+1 as a function of the fertility of the different stage classes. The 0 here is because infants don't breed. The A here is the density dependence on the average fecundity of adults, and then the subadult class can come in and breed or not depending on the density. And so we make that density dependent as well. Whoop. Uh-oh, what's going on? Okay, we're okay.
No, you need to full screen.
Are we okay? Okay. So, and then here are the survival terms. So these are the survival, and again, they're density dependent. And we've done experiments with our cite and recite to be able to tune the model to realistic values, because if you put in toy values, then you're just guessing at what's going on. And so we've been able to look at how much density changes the age of first reproduction, fecundity, and survival, so that these are realistic parameters. And then we can do manipulations, thought experiments. What if we change the intensity of predation on these particular age classes, for example? Well, here's the data based on the level of predation and the survival rates that we've gotten from our foal patrol and from our cite-recite. There's a 27% foal survival and 88% adult survival, and when you put those numbers into the model, you see that the numbers decline by 50%. Grevy zebras on the Lewa Conservancy are expected to decline by 50% over 30 years. Not a healthy situation. If we look at other ranches, like in Laikipia and Impala, where the lion density is much lower, we see that the population would only decline by about 15 to 20% over 30 years, a much healthier situation. Why the difference? Because the lion density in the background of the ranches where ranches surreptitiously poison lions is about 6 per 100 square kilometers, whereas on Lewa, the density is 29 per 100 square kilometers because they're in the business of ecotourism. Their tourists want to see the rare Grevy zebra and they want to see the lion. And so lion densities have been maintained high. In the background, the infant survival rate is much higher than on Lewa, 50% as opposed to 27%, and the adult survival is 80%, slightly lower than the adult survival rate on Lewa. Now we can do a thought experiment and run the model. What if we could boost the infant survival to 50%? If we did that, the 450 Grevies on Lewa would quickly increase to an average of about 622 at the end of 30 years. In other words, Grevy's numbers on Lewa would increase by almost 50%. If we could regulate the intensity of predation. That's the big if in the equation. And so we then petitioned the government. Now that requires a number of steps. And here's the proposal that I wrote for the scientists on Lewa. And you'll see in red, we explain this as an adaptive management experiment. Our preliminary data indicate that lions are a problem, and we'd like to do a 3-year study on the lions to see if, in fact, by taking some away in parts of the Lewa Reserve, so we have a control and an experiment, could we, in fact, change the number of zebras that are there? And by running it through our models, could we figure out why the change is taking place? And we did it as a 3-year experiment that if, in fact, it worked, we'd come back to them with a management plan, and if it didn't, we'd come back with another experiment. And so we took this to the Grevy Zebra Technical Committee, which is chaired by a member of the Kenya Wildlife Service. I'm on it. And then we made a recommendation unanimously to make this proposal real. So it goes to the Kenya Wildlife Service, and it goes to the Predator Technical Committee. And the lion people said, absolutely not. And so we have conflicting interests, makes this difficult to do the adaptive management experiment. And as a consequence, KWS said, sorry, you can't do it. And as a result, the number of lions are increasing, the number of grevies are decreasing. And so the question is, if we can't get respite from the top-down management to support these plans, can we go the other way to work from the bottom up? Can we work with the people, the landowners themselves, to find solutions to the problem that science is identifying is very real? And the basic tenet of behavioral ecology is that the environment shapes behavior. To some extent, behavioral ecologists also look at how behavior feeds back and transforms the environment. But we mostly try to understand why a species has a particular mating system. Why is it monogamous? Why is it polygamous? And we implicate distribution of resources that affect how males and females move about the landscape. And we can show by comparative analysis that in different environments, the mating system is different. Or we can show that in different environments, the optimal strategy of foraging is different. And so that's how we get this linkage, that environment shapes the behavior we see real animals doing in the real world. And therefore, we can conclude that generally, if the environment changes, the behavior of the animal is going to change. Now, if that behavior is flexible enough so the animal has a solution to the problem on its own, it can sustain itself. But 90% of the time, species, as they change their behavior to the change in the environment, find themselves stressed. They have problems they can't solve on their own. And so is it possible that when we see a change in the environment, changing the species' behavior so that it's not so good, can we as humans intervene to change the behavior of the humans that caused the problem, to alter their impact on the environment, to give the species a chance, using the natural tendency for species to respond flexibly to the environment? So this is the model that we're talking about, and the best way to do it is to deal with humans on the ground that are connected to the environment that caused the problem. So we go and we look at the Olpegida Conservancy, where they have a lion problem as well, as you can see from the data. So we have the same problem, but do we have more success? So running our model, where the lion density is like it is on Lewa, 31 per square kilometer, the adult survival is lower than Lewa and lower than the background, and the infant survival is infinitesimal based on these lions. And you see the population, essentially, of plain zebras goes extinct 15 years out. So their problem is much more real and much more critical than even the Lewa problem. And so what we noticed is that the Olpegida Conservancy was undergoing new management, and previously it was owned by a company that set aside a reserve of 100 square kilometers called Sweetwaters, and many of you probably have been on safari there, and a farm and a ranch where they hunted zebras to send to their abattoir when the government let them hunt zebras. And you can see that where they did the culling, the population, the ranch, had a much better age structure. Many more infants and juveniles relative to adults than in Sweetwaters, where the tourism industry dominated, where the lion density was very high. Very few infants and very few juveniles. And if you draw a pyramid that we use in population biology to try to understand when species are endangered, we see that the situation on the reserve side is one that looks like Italy. There are no infants, no juveniles sustaining the adult population. But over on the western side, where the cattle industry presumably keeps some of the lion density down, you have a healthier population with relatively more recruits to sustain those that are naturally lost by natural mortality or lost by predation. And so as the ownership took over this area, they decided to integrate the two pieces of land by fencing the entire reserve, leaving gaps in the north fence so that wildlife could go in and out. And we asked them then to take the fence down very quickly between the reserves to see if homogenizing, equalizing the lion intensity of predation would occur. So we then, after they took the internal fence down, looked to see what was happening. The year after they took the internal fence down, no big difference. The population looked like it was still at risk. And so we were concerned. But 2 years out, in 2010, because they took the fence down in 2008, notice what happens. You're starting to get recruits, and the population has 27% recruits, which seems to be the sustainable part to make sure a population can have enough recruits to take over for the adults that die. So it looked very good that the homogenization of the lions, by reducing the intensity of predation in any particular square kilometer, was having a good beneficial effect. But what we wanted to do is look longer term. And just to remind you what these pyramids look like is a growing population, the population of Kenya, that's got lots of babies and infants and juveniles. It looks like this, and the population's growing. Population of Italy that has very few babies being born is one that is declining. And a stable age distribution, like in the US, looks like a column. So these are the three caricatures of populations that are growing, stable, or declining. And what we now do is we have a very fast algorithm for looking at individuals by their stripes. The original data was gathered by just driving around and counting young, juveniles, and adults, and not coming back to recount. Clearly, a cite, recite, mark, recapture would give better estimates, and we can now do that with our new program called HotSpotter that can recognize the stripes and tell whether that species, that individual is that individual, which it is. It's morphing into IBIS, the integrated image-based ecological information system that computer scientists and I are working on to grab immediately the who, what, and where, so we can then, the who, what, and when from the image, so we can add the what, the biological metadata that ecologists want to answer their why questions. So IBIS will be available soon for anybody that's working on any organism that has natural marks, from an insect to a fish to a bird to a mammal. And when we look this year at the populations on Alpegida, we see that our optimism was falsely placed, that in fact the populations on both the east and the west are failing. When we look at other populations, we go back to Lewa using stripe recognition, the Grevy's zebra is in still trouble. The population numbers are declining. Barana called me and said, could you check out our plain zebras? We're not sure that we have enough anymore. We went up to Barana, did a 3-day survey with the stripes, and showed that their population looks like this. We worked at Impala and Old Jogi, both the Grevy zebra and plain zebra, in the background area where lion density is only 6 per 100 square kilometer, and the populations look like this. Why the difference? Intensity of lion predation. And to the theme of the talk, before I get to that, we can see what's happened on Alpegida. This was the original data, about 45 lions distributed on the eastern sector and the western sector. Today we have about 85 lions, more of them on the western sector than the eastern sector. Lion predation intensity has increased. Not surprisingly, the population is declining, not only of zebras, but also of the endangered Lelwell, particular race of the hartebeest. Lions are a serious problem if they're allowed to grow to be too many. So the question then becomes, can we approach the Kenya Wildlife Service and talk about zoning? Different parts of Kenya having different priorities of species for protection. Because the communities are structured in different ways, the ecosystems have different dynamics. And so we requested Rosie Woodruff, who studies wild dogs, and I, from the government, to make the Grevy zebra the charismatic species that was priority number 1 in the semi-arid areas, and the lion could retain its number 1 status in the more mesic areas. In fact, if we translocated lions from the semi-arid areas into the mesic areas where they're being persecuted, it could be a win-win solution. And guess what the answer was? No. Okay? So once again, we're back to where we are, intense lion predation. So now we turn to case number 2, working with the people again. And this time we're going to work with the pastoral people where water becomes the problem. It's very rare and it's very scattered, and the herds are growing because the population of humans is growing, and the herds use the water from 7 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock at night. And so the question is, does competition for water and forage harm the Grevy zebra? And the way we're getting at this is we set up a scout program. We can't travel on this landscape because there's no roads. We can't do our traditional biology. And besides, you saw the number of group ranches scattered on that landscape. So what we do is we work in 8 group ranches where we pay scouts, 2 women and 1 man in each community. They get 3 days' wage. They make about $600 a year, which is huge for people that have no other income stream. The women go out and collect firewood and water, so they intensively survey the bushier areas. The men do the herding, so they survey the more open areas where the grazing competition could be very real. They're given check sheets to record the nature of the landscape, the presence or absence of water, the openness of the habitat, the presence or absence of other livestock and wildlife, and critically, they have icons that say what type of grevies are there: males, females, bachelors, territorial, lactators, non-lactators, juveniles, infants, by sex, and they record how many they see standing, walking, or eating. Based on this data, we can start to put together population dynamics of the landscape. And then we meet every year with the scouts as they present their data that we analyze to the communities. It's a community where men talk to men, women talk to women, except our scouts, who have tremendous status, can talk to both the men and the women. So it's like an Orthodox shul where the men and women are separated. And so they earn income, but in fact, they're poised to gain even more. And what they gain is an appreciation and an ownership of this charismatic species. Maria, the scout in that picture, she started one of the barazas, one of the meetings, by saying, "I now understand my zebras." Empowerment, engagement. She takes ownership for those zebras, and she becomes a champion of those zebras. So this is some of the data displayed in a cartoon that we show the local people. This is the group size of Grevy zebras as a function of time of day. And it's a puzzle. They're very small in the morning. They're very large in the evening. And everybody says, oh, it's Mr. Simba here. The lion keeps them in large groups. That's how they protect themselves. But the question then becomes, why are there large groups before the lion is active? And every one of the Samburu look at their feet. Silence. They know the answer. And one of the elders stands up and says, "We know why, Professor. We control the water, and they stand around all day, not eating, ready to drink." Now, we know drinking, ideally, occurs just before midday. So on Lewa, where there are no cows, they prefer to drink between 10 and noon, both the plain zebra and the Grevy zebra. 10 and noon is exactly when the dominant members of the tribe are monopolizing the water. So they stand around, they only drink at night, which in theory makes them more vulnerable to predators, so why should they be there, but they have no choice to be there. So that's one impact. The second impact, which I talked a little bit about yesterday, is it's not surprising from the check sheets that only 30% of the sightings have Grevy zebra with livestock. The livestock are placed on the best vegetation because they're in the business of fattening for milk so kids have protein. The pastoral people do this. And the Grevies tend to spend 70% of their time on the less good vegetation. We present this result to the people. This is the actual data. We don't show them this. We show them the cartoons. And one year when I made the presentation, the Morani, the warriors, jumped up and said, "Professor, we don't do that anymore. We don't throw the sticks and stones at them in the morning to drive them to small groups. We don't put our dogs on them any longer to keep them away from water. We share the landscape." And I said, well, I have another year's worth of data. We can actually check that. And sure enough, the sightings are now on average 50% of the herds are on the good land with the livestock. The people changed their behavior within 1 year based on the fact that they're part of the solution. They understand the dynamics, they make money off of wildlife, but they've got champions who work with the communities, members of their own community, to suggest changes in their behavior. And so this is now the distribution. Mr. Simba is still active at night, but the herds are small at night. So much for our intuitive wisdom that zebras form large groups to protect themselves against lions. And in fact, what you see is the herd size is not statistically significantly different across any time of day. Zebras are free to move, ideally as they feel. And this is what the landscape looks like, mixtures now of zebras and cattle. And what's really critically important, if you look at year here on the x-axis and the fraction of infants and juveniles on the y-axis, there was a drought here between 2009 and 2010. Notice the fraction total, of the recruits, the infants, the juveniles and the infants. It's 23% of the population. The population is turning around because there are recruits on this landscape replacing the mortality of the adults. But they're only one stakeholder. an important stakeholder because the Grevy's zebra evolved. The center of its historical range is in Samburu, where they now have conflict potentially with pastoralists, and we've seen that changing the pastoralist behavior can lead to big changes. The second stakeholder I want to talk about are the commercial ranches. They dominate the good land. And the good land is where they make their profit. And so we've done an experiment with herds of cattle and donkeys as surrogate zebras, to measure the impact of the grazing of the donkeys and the cattle when they share the landscape. And these different blocks represent different areas where we kept the stocking densities different. One, we kept the stocking density at 2 tropical livestock units, 2 cows, per hectare, which is what commercial ranches do. And then we did the other at 6 tropical livestock units per hectare, which is what the pastoral herders do. And then we measured weight change, diet choice, feeding rate, and parasite loads. And this was our team of Kenyan herders who've been through high school so they could record data. This is the team of scientists that were measuring the weight of the animals every 2 weeks, collecting the poop for parasite every 2 weeks, and these are the results. And the way to read these panels is to look at the cattle perspective and the donkey perspective. And you can see from either perspective that the gray bars, the mixtures of donkeys and cattle, always do better than the white bars, pure stands of cattle or pure stands of donkeys in terms of weight gain. This is very important. The zebras and the wildlife facilitate each other. They're not competitors during most of the year. So the presence together is good. We were able to get the mechanism. It has to do with feeding rate. Again, you can see the gray bars are higher than the white bars. And we know the mechanism from feeding rate is that the cattle benefit because the donkeys eat Ceteria. They come in first and they eat a poor grass that changes the structure of the habitat that lets light in. And when it rains in August, then the light rains during the summer, the grass grows. When we do the experiments, the donkeys increase the greenness of these grasses that the cattle like and the crude protein, so the cattle do better. We know that the donkeys benefit because the cows serve as sponges. They're eating the parasites as they eat the grass and the forbs, but the parasites don't affect them, and therefore they reduce the parasites by 35% in the dung of the donkeys, and they keep the egg per gram lower than 1,500, where morbidity starts. So for different currencies, the species benefit each other. So sharing is possible. Now the question becomes, and this is where the story gets interesting, is that we can look at cattle and their impact by putting GPS tags on them, and we can see how they use the landscape every week. So this is 3 weeks of data of this cattle herd, and we can then make a heat map and put it on a Google map, but better than that, we can put it on an NDVI map from the MODIS satellites. So we can look at the intensity of use and the greenness of the habitat where they're grazing. And we can look at the cattle during a 3-week period and ask 3 weeks later what the green up is. How does the percent green, the digestibility, and the quality of the vegetation change? And you see a very strong positive relationship here, that the cattle, when they more intensively use an area, tend to green it up after the rains. And the greenness has a huge impact on the attraction to the wildlife species we looked at. Remember, we have small, medium, and large ruminants, and we had small, medium, and the rhinos were not in our particular area, so we only had the small and medium where it was done. And you can see that all the relationships are positive, but they're statistically significant for the big-bodied species as well as for both of the hindgut fermenters. In other words, the presence of cattle grazing on the landscape can increase the quality of the vegetation that attracts the wildlife numerically from other areas to enrich the landscape. This benefits ecotourism, and it keeps the biodiversity high. And so the moral of the tale is wildlife and livestock can live together, and cattle can maintain diverse ecosystems and therefore preserve biodiversity. But the problem is the nature of cattle herding is changing. And what we're seeing is that there's pressure to become Western, to fence all the areas so that the cattle can graze 24 hours per day. Why forego 12 hours of feeding when you can have 24? But the cost to us as ecologists is the wildlife movements will be negatively affected. Can I just... Okay. And what we see is we've done an experiment on the old Pedgeta Conservancy. DNG means day and night grazing in a fenced area, and not surprisingly, they gain a ton of weight. Traditional herding strategies of putting them in a boma at night to keep them safe from lions, if it's a large herd, big difference in growth rate. Medium herd, small but statistically significant difference in growth rate. A small herd of just 100 cows, no difference in growth rate from the day-night grazing. And they look at the crude organic matter in their diet, the same thing. So that, in fact, there's no need to go to 24-hour grazing by fencing and dividing the landscape if herders keep their herds small. And therefore, this eliminates the need for fencing. We also know that there's pressure for bunched grazing for holistic management. And the logic of this is that if you force cows to be together in a bunch, they can't selectively feed. They can't choose to eat the good vegetation. They have to eat everything, good and bad. And this then homogenizes the landscape and gives the slower growing good grass the opportunity to grow more quickly when it does rain. And we noticed that the cattle grow faster when they're herded in a bunch group than business as usual is unbunched, both on black cotton soil and red soil. But what's interesting is the savory method doesn't talk about cost savings. They talk about the benefits as active, and it turns out they get it wrong, that in fact the reason they're growing faster is the bunched herds don't walk as much. And that's how they don't spend energy and they do better. So we have the mechanism. And lastly, does this really benefit the herders themselves, the poor people, not the people on the rich ranches? And again, we've worked with sheep and goats, and we've looked at the legacy of grazing. And what's really cool is this is data from 1 month ago. These are the herds of goats on a landscape in Koija and Omotiak. And here are the homes, the manyadas where they live. And here they are going to water every day and back and grazing. And what we've done is we've looked at Omotiak that has switched to holistic management, and Koija, which has maintained the traditional business as usual, let your herds do what they want to do while you guide them back and forth from water.
If you need to move slides.
We only have a few more slides. Okay. All right. So this is the movement, and what's important is that the holistic management team understood the dynamics of this ranch. So this is the lugga that separates the two ranches. First thing you see is this Koija family cheats, and they come on onto Omotiak. These areas are the regions of the bunched grazing, and they graze them, only let them graze there for 14 days, the cattle. And what we're looking at in this experiment is after the cattle are done, after they've transformed the landscape, in this case, it's drought, so they're somewhere else on the landscape right now. But the goats and sheep are still there. How did the families within goats and sheep use the landscape that's been manipulated by the bunch grazing and not manipulated by the bunch grazing? And we can look at their tracks, and we can look at their growth rate, and we can look at the milk yield. Some families spend a lot of time in the bunch grazing areas, others don't. And so here's the final results. The first thing, using production cages, so we exclude grazing to measure how the grass is growing, is where the cattle were bunch grazing, the grass is growing faster than where there was no bunch grazing. The goats that spend most of their time in the bunch grazing area are growing faster than those that are not, and there's a tendency after 3 weeks of data that the milk yield is higher for the families that are letting their animals and encouraging their animals to graze in the holistic cattle grazed area. So the rangeland, human lifestyles, and health are improving from adopting the holistic grazing management practices. So how do we pull this all together? We have the Grevy's zebra living on a landscape. We have a story in which it's a charismatic megafauna. Can it be preserved? And therefore, can it improve the landscape and protect the others? Can it be this focal individual that garners the support of the government, the tourists, and other people that are focused on Africa. We started the talk by looking as it should be. Protecting elephants, especially if they roam free, can maintain biodiversity. We saw that the Grevy's zebra represents the case as it is, and it's much more complicated. It's complicated because the problem is one of predation, and as we approached Kenya Wildlife Service, I took this off their web. I thought it was kind of cute. We listen. They might listen, but they don't act. They did not help us in any way to reduce predation, and therefore the numbers of Grevy's are going down, and the landscape is going to suffer because they're a keystone species. They do the grazing as lawnmowers to keep it open so that there's not encroachment of bush because there's no more fire used to open the landscape. So they're critical. But by working not top down but bottom up, especially with the herds of the poorest people, we actually see that the landscape can be transformed, and the Grevy's zebra, one of the major threats, competition from livestock, can be eliminated. So the irony is that the problem, cows, become the solution to keeping the Grevy's zebra and its ecosystem functioning normally. And therefore, if you protect the Grevy's zebra, you can protect the ecosystem. Sometimes it works by working with the rich landowners to distribute the lion intensity, at least for a short while, or with the pastoralists to let them use their cattle in an experimental way that improves the landscape. If you protect the Grevy's and you protect the ecosystem and you benefit the people. And if you benefit the people, you sustain this biodiversity cycle where the people and wildlife can live together and maintain a dynamic ecosystem that protects a wealth of species. Toda rabah.